I'm Aaron Rutten, and this is a demonstration of the Nature Brush Pack I created for Rebelle. You can download these brushes from my website at aaronrutten.com. The first brush that we'll look at is called Cloud Knife. I'll select white for my color. As you might expect, this brush can paint clouds. You can change the angle of the dab by changing the angle of your pen if your pen supports pen tilt. Or if you're using the Wacom Art Pen, you can change the angle using barrel rotation. So if I keep my dab flat, I can make a flat cloud like this. Or if I turn it and I make it wide, I can make a wide cloud like this. And you can, of course, create everything in between. You can get some really random cloud shapes. Pen pressure controls the opacity and blending. So if I press down lightly, I'll get a thin, faint cloud. If I press down heavily, I will get a very thick cloud. And of course, if I use lighter pressure, I can blend the cloud to soften the edges. And if I switch to heavier pressure, then I can start to lay down paint again. The trick with this brush is to just be spontaneous and let the clouds come out without overthinking them too much. The next brush we'll look at is called Cloudy. This one has an interesting dab shape. It looks sort of like a bird. And what I want is for this pointy part to point up to get the top of the clouds. This is another brush that responds to the tilt or direction your pen is pointed. So if I want these curved shapes to go this way, I'm pointing my pen toward this direction. If I want them to go the other way, I point my pen the other way. Now for me, it's difficult to draw at this angle, so what I can do is press Shift F, and I can easily flip my canvas so that now I'm painting more comfortably. What I want to do is have this pointed up, create the nice tops of the clouds like so, and then use lighter pressure, which controls the blending and softness of the brush, to put in a bottom of the cloud here. But what would be even more effective is if we lower the opacity to about halfway, then we put in the cloud shape, lift my pen up, paint over it again several times while lifting my pen up, and as you can see, it builds up these really nice cloud shapes. This has a lot more form. I'll hold down Control and drag up, and that will increase the opacity of my brush. And I can just tap to put in some highlights here on these cloud forms. And now we get a cloud with more dimension to it. If we look in the brush creator under Shape and Grain, you can see that down under Rotation, this is using Follow Trajectory. This allows me to sort of use this brush with a mouse, but it doesn't work very well. If your pen can utilize pen tilt, then it will default to pen tilt, which feels more natural. And again, if you're using the Wacom Art Pen, then you can have it default to rotation, so I can rotate my dab like this. It doesn't matter which way it's pointing, I will always maintain that same dab shape. Another thing we can do with this cloudy brush is go to Paint, and you can see here under Paint Blending, it's set to Screen. This means if I select a color that's darker than white, I can paint some strokes, lift my pen up, paint over it again, and it will build up automatically to a lighter color. This will allow me to quickly and easily put in clouds without having to switch my color. If you don't like this effect, you can of course disable it temporarily. Now when I paint and I build up strokes, they just stay that same color. You can reset these brushes with the reset button here. I'll lower my opacity to 50%, slowly build up this cloud like so. Hold down Control, drag up to increase my opacity, and then I can get a cloud with more depth. Let's move on to take a look at Hazy. I'll switch back to white for my color. If I paint a stroke with this brush, you can see I get this nice hazy cloudy effect. If I use it over here on this landscape painting, you can see I can put in this really nice mist or fog down here at the bottom. Pressure controls the opacity and blending, so if I press lightly, I'll get a very thin mist. If I press heavily, I'll get a very thick mist. And if it's too lumpy, I can use lighter pressure and kind of blend over it to merge it together and mix it up. If I switch to black, I can also use this brush for smoke. As you can see, I can create nice billowing smoke like this. The size of the brush controls the feature scale, or the size of the little puffs that are in the clouds. If I want those to be smaller, then I make my brush smaller. Next, we'll take a look at a brush that is called Rainy. I'll select white for my color. And I'm going to paint in the direction that I want my rain to flow. So if I want it to go diagonally down and to the left, that's the direction I'm painting. This brush is using Follow Trajectory. So if I start painting straight down, then my rain will go more or less straight down. Let's put some of that in the scene here. The size of your brush controls the droplet length and size. So if I make my brush smaller, then those droplets are going to be a little bit shorter and thinner. You can see that better over here. If I make my brush much larger, then you can see those streaks are much longer and thicker. Under stroke, spacing controls the density of the droplets. So with this density here, or this spacing, I get droplets like this. But if I decrease that, then I get many more at once. These raindrops are fairly opaque, but if I want them to be thinner, then I can reduce the opacity, and now they'll blend in more with the painting. Let's see what the snowy brush can do. Keep painting with white, and I get these really nice snowflakes. Size controls the size of the feature, so if I make my brush larger, those snowflakes will be larger. And just like the previous brush, I can control the density by adjusting the spacing. So if I want there to be fewer snowflakes per stroke, I'll set the density or the spacing higher. If I want there to be more, then I'll set it lower. I'll reset this brush, and I'll just paint it in the scene here, and you can see how it looks. Now, of course, this isn't the right season for snow, but what I could use this brush for is some little dandelions. It doesn't necessarily have to be just for snow. Press my right bracket key to make my brush a little bit larger, and as I move into the foreground, I can make those shapes larger so they look like they're in perspective. The next brush we'll explore is called Oily Ripples. If I demonstrate with this brush over here, you can see it's a very thin brush. It's broken up a little bit, and this is meant to be used to draw little ripples in the water. If I use it over here, you can see I can go right along the edge. Because it's broken up, it helps it look more natural. There's also these horizontal negative lines that go through, and that just helps to keep your water looking very level. Do some ripples over here as well where this fish is hiding. You could use this for sea foam and all kinds of great stuff. The size controls the thickness of the ripples, so if I want it to be thinner, I can make my brush much smaller, or I can make my brush larger to make those ripples thicker. Let's see what oily waves can do. If I paint with this brush, you can see I get this really nice wave pattern. If I lift my pen and overlap several strokes, this will build up lighter. I could also select a darker color like this and have it gradually build up. The size of the brush controls the feature size of the waves, so if I want those to be smaller, I make my brush smaller. Let's try adding some of this to the water here. We'll reflect in some of this dirt, maybe some of the grass color. Make my color lighter and paint on top to get these nice reflections, and just let it build up. For these brushes that build up, you may want to set the blending mode to screen, and you may want to play with the opacity to help it blend in better. You can see that works pretty well. I'll set this back to normal and increase the opacity back to 100%. You may also want to switch to the erase mode, and you can subtract from this using that same pattern. This just helps to break it up, and it looks a little bit more natural. If I erase over here, you can see how that's working. I'm getting that same pattern, but in negative space. Here's another brush called Water Texture. We'll switch to white and paint some strokes. If I use lighter pressure, then I'm going to blend. If I use heavier pressure, then I'm going to cover, and I can get everything in between. Let's put some of this on the water here and just fade it out. You can see it creates these great reflections on the water. You'll want to make sure you're only doing horizontal strokes because any other direction ruins the effect, though this might work well for bricks on a wall. You can also switch to the eraser mode by pressing 5 or holding 5, and you can use negative painting to subtract from that. Now let's take a look at Splashy. Let's say there's a splash happening right here. I can curve the splash by curving my strokes, or I can dab with it. You'll notice it builds up rather slowly, so I need to layer my strokes, or I can increase my opacity if I want it to be very thick. But starting with a lower opacity will help build up the form more slowly. This brush might also work well for creating waterfalls or rivers or other sorts of flowing water. And if I start with a darker color and I build up my strokes, this will build up lighter like some of the other brushes. And again, if you don't like that, you can disable it here. The remaining brushes can use impasto or paint thickness. Let's start with stones. When I paint with this brush, it has a flat dab, and I can angle my pen to change the angle of the dab. Let's have the bottom be sort of flat like this, and then we will build up a nice stone like this. You'll see it has a bit of lumpiness or thickness to it. All of these Impasto brushes will have that. You can control the Impasto depth globally using the visual settings. So if I want to remove it, I can do that. Or if I want to make it stronger, I can do that. I'll keep it set to 5. In the paint properties of the brush creator, you can also look under max Impasto height. This is a per stroke setting rather than a global setting. So even though I have Impasto enabled for this stroke, if I remove this and I paint a stroke, it won't have that texture. I'll reset this brush. I'll select a lighter color, and I'll use lighter pressure. When I do that, I'm going to get more of this paint break effect where there's gaps in the paint. If I press firmly, I won't get that. And this can be useful to build up the form of your stone. If you enable lock transparency, then you won't accidentally paint outside that stone shape, and you can very easily put in your nice stone here. Make my color a little bit lighter and put in some highlights. Again, using light to medium pressure so that I get that paint break effect. I can press 4 to switch to the blending mode, and now I'm only blending, and I can mix some of those colors together. I'll reset this brush, and I'll disable lock transparency. The size of the brush controls the size of the features, so if I make my brush larger, then those texture features will be a bit wider. If I make it smaller, then they'll be much finer. So I could also go in here with a smaller brush and put in some little cracks and crevices, and I can create some really interesting stones. They can even be really simple single strokes like this if I want to put in some little stones and just add a bit of a highlight to them. Similar to stones is the mountain brush. Again, the angle of your pen controls the angle of the stroke. I'll use a dark blue here to paint in a mountain shape. With my pen pointed up, I will get these nice jagged mountain peaks. And I can just fill in the rest like so. Lighter pressure will begin to create paint break and blend and smudge a little bit. So I can do that to fade the bottom out here like this. Again, you can play with the global opacity setting, or you can control it per stroke here. Scale controls the feature size. So if I make my brush larger, those features will be larger. The loading setting controls the thickness of the texture and therefore the distance of the mountain. So if I want a more distant mountain, I'll set loading much lower. And now I get something that builds up slowly because it's less opaque and it doesn't have all that texture in it, which helps it look farther away. If I want something kind of in between, I can set the loading a little bit higher and maybe just a bit higher to go in front of that. If I lock the transparency and I select a lighter color, then I can use light to medium pressure to put in some texture here on the mountain. And this helps it look more three-dimensional. I can make my color lighter and add some lighter colors on top of that. And I can even switch to the blending mode, and I can blend the colors together like so. Here's the Pebbles brush. Switch to a dark brown color like this, and put in some pebbles here. The size of the brush controls the size of the pebbles, so if I make my brush larger, then I'll get bigger pebbles. The spacing of the brush controls the density, so if I increase that, then I'll get fewer pebbles per stroke. I can also use light to medium pressure to get thinner pebbles that don't have as much texture. So this might look more like dirt rather than rocks. And if I build up heavier pressure on top of that, then I can thicken it up a bit. Many of these brushes can also utilize multicolor mode. If I enable that, and I hold X and either sample on the canvas or click on the color picker, then I can create pebbles that have multiple colors in them. We'll hold X and click to add in some black colors. Now you can see they're a different color. And if we use them over here, you can see they fit into the scene very nicely. And if I use lighter pressure, I can make them look like they kind of go under the water. If you want it to be one single color again, then you just disable multicolored brush mode. Rocky is an interesting brush. If I paint a stroke, you can see I get this nice thick rocky texture. Lighter pressure will give me a thinner, more transparent result without as much thickness to it. Heavier pressure will make the paint nice and thick. The size of the brush controls the size of the features, so I can make those a bit smaller or a bit larger. Spacing controls the density. Again, you can control the impasto if you want to make that thicker or thinner. And if you want to make the brush multicolor, then you can do that. This works really well if you build up a lot of different layers and colors. You'll get a really nice rocky looking effect. Let's try out flowers. I'm going to disable multicolored brush mode, select kind of a light pink flower color, and I'll paint over here on the grass, and you can see I can put in these nice flowers. Make my brush a bit bigger as I move into the foreground, and then I'll get that nice sense of perspective. You may be able to see these flowers have a little bit of texture to them. Again, you can edit that with the Impasto depth. Spacing controls the density of the flowers. And if I want the flowers to look more interesting, I'll add multicolor mode and sample some other colors here. And now when I paint my flowers, they have multiple colors in them. If I use lighter pressure, those flowers will get a bit smaller. But again, I want to reduce my brush size so that they look like they're going off into perspective here. And we can of course mix in different colors of flowers as well. Moving on, we have the Frosty brush. I'll select white for my color. If I paint a stroke, you can see I get this nice frosty effect with a bit of texture. I can build it up like so to make it thicker. Pressure controls the opacity, so I can make it much thinner or much thicker if I use heavier pressure. You'll also notice that heavier pressure gives me more texture and lighter pressure gives me less. I'll paint some of that over here on the dirt if we want that to look sort of frosty. If I want those features to be larger, I'll make my brush larger. And if I want them to be finer, I'll make my brush much smaller. If we zoom in closely, you can see these blobs are very distinct, but if I use lighter pressure over them, then I can kind of flatten them out a bit so they don't have as much highlight on them, or I can use heavier pressure to build them up thickly. The final brush we'll look at is called Brambles. If I paint with this brush, you can see it creates these nice brambly patterns. Lighter pressure gives me smaller brambles. Heavier pressure gives me bigger brambles. I can control the density with spacing, so I can have fewer like this. Put in a few over here. Let's have some coming out over the water like this. And then of course I can layer up the colors like so. And this just helps to create lots of intricate detail. And like the other brushes, if the impasto is too thick, then you can reduce it to get the exact effect that you want. There you go, that was a demonstration of my nature brushes for Rebelle. Again, you can get these at my website at aaronrutten.com.